On the morning of July 12, 2022, in the small Louisiana town of Houma, a sanitation worker noticed something unusual on Dusbet Street, a black duffel bag stuffed into a residential trash can, surrounded by a swarm of ants that seemed to move with unusual urgency. The worker nearly passed by. Nearly. But the smell stopped him cold, that unmistakable scent every first responder learns to recognize. He called his supervisor, who called the police, and within 20 minutes, Police Chief Dana Coleman arrived at a scene 2 blocks from his own station. Coleman had served 23 years on the Louisiana force. He'd worked homicides, drug busts, domestic calls that turned violent. He thought he'd catalogued every variation of human cruelty. When he unzipped that duffel bag, he discovered he was wrong. 18 hours of Louisiana July heat had done their work. Inside the bag, curled in a fetal position, lay a toddler in light-colored pajamas patterned with innocent cartoon characters. The child's hands were folded across his chest, as if trying to shield himself even in death. His face bore the marks of systematic violence, bruises layered over bruises, injuries at different stages of healing. The hands themselves were mangled from repeated blows. Coleman stepped back from the trash can and vomited onto the pavement. His officers stood in shocked silence. Somewhere in this town, a family was searching for this child. Somewhere, helicopters circled and search dogs tracked scent trails, and volunteers combed through brush and bayou. And all that time, the answer sat in a trash can within sight of the police station itself. The child's name was Ezekiel Harry. He was 2 years and 11 months old. In 3 days, there was supposed to be a custody hearing. In 3 days, his father was scheduled to present evidence that would grant him full custody and remove Ezekiel and his siblings from their mother's care permanently. The lawyers had told Trey Harry Sr. the case looked strong. Just hold on a little longer, they said. Just a few more days. But those 3 days might as well have been 3 years. Ezekiel didn't have 3 days. What happened in the house at 145 Cadier Street, a house provided by a domestic violence shelter, a house that was supposed to be a fortress of protection, would expose failures at every level of a system designed to save children exactly like him. Before we go deeper into this investigation, subscribe if you love true crime documentaries built on verified facts and psychological analysis, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your engagement helps stories like Ezekiel's reach people who can make a difference. Nearly 1,500 miles to the east, in Atlanta's Oakland City neighborhood, another family was disintegrating in slow motion. On October 13, 2017, almost 5 years before Ezekiel's body was discovered, a 911 operator received a call that would haunt her for years. The caller was Lamora Williams, 24 years old, and her voice carried a strange quality that experienced dispatchers learned to recognize. Not quite panic, not quite grief, but something calculated beneath the surface. "My 2 babies are dead," she told the operator. "My cousin left them alone and they knocked over the stove." But even as she spoke, the operator noted something odd. Williams kept asking not about her children, but about herself. "Will I be arrested? Am I going to jail? This isn't my fault, right?" When police arrived at the Howell Place apartment just after 11:30 that night, they found a scene that contradicted Williams' story in almost every detail. An electric oven lay overturned in the kitchen. Beneath it were the bodies of 2-year-old Keyaunti Penn and 1-year-old Jakarta Penn. Their 3-year-old brother, Jamil Jr., stood silently in the living room beside his mother, his face blank with the kind of shock that comes from witnessing something no child should see. He hadn't cried in hours. He just hiccuped quietly and stared at the floor. The apartment reeked of death, a smell neighbors would later admit they'd noticed for days but hadn't reported. And Williams's story about being at work when a cousin left the children alone began falling apart within minutes of the first detective's questions. 2 cases, 2 sets of children, 2 mothers, 1,500 miles and 5 years apart, yet connected by a common thread. Systems designed to protect the most vulnerable that failed repeatedly, despite clear warnings and desperate pleas. In Louisiana, neighbors called police 3 times in 3 weeks. In Georgia, a grandmother called Child Protective Services almost daily, begging them to remove her grandchildren from danger. In both cases, officers came, saw bruises or heard explanations, and left. In both cases, the children paid the ultimate price for bureaucratic inertia and policies that prioritized parental rights over children's safety. This is the story of Ezekiel, Harry, and the Penn brothers. Not just how they died, but how every safety net meant to catch them was full of holes large enough for small bodies to slip through. Let's begin in Louisiana on August 8, 2019, in a delivery room at Terrebonne General Hospital in Thibodaux. Maya Jones, 25, gave birth to her fourth child, a boy weighing 7 pounds 6 ounces. His father, Trey Harry Sr., held his son for the first time and felt that overwhelming rush of love and responsibility that comes with new fatherhood. They named him Ezekiel. Maya already had 3 children: Brooklyn, 7 years old, Taylor, 5, and Trey Jr., 4. The family seemed complete. Grandmother Cynthia Harry stood by the window looking at her 4th grandson and immediately began calling him Zeke, a nickname that would stick. He was a calm baby, almost eerily so. He rarely cried, and when he did, only his father seemed able to soothe him. Trey would hold Ezekiel against his chest, and the baby would quiet instantly, as if recognizing safety. The older children adored their baby brother with the fierce, protective love that siblings often develop. Brooklyn and Taylor took turns feeding him, carefully supporting his head the way the nurses had shown them. 4-year-old Trey Jr. couldn't wait until Ezekiel grew big enough to play. He had plans for trucks and balls and all the games brothers play. They slept in one room even though the house had space for separate bedrooms. Together felt safer. But beneath this surface of family life, cracks were forming in Maya and Trey's relationship. Maya had what family members delicately called a temper. She would explode over minor infractions, spilled juice, noise, bad grades. She'd scream for hours. Objects would fly. And increasingly she'd hit the children, not in momentary anger but with a sustained fury that frightened Trey. He endured it for the children's sake, operating under the common but flawed logic that children are better off in an intact household, even if that household is volatile. By the summer of 2020, when Ezekiel turned 1, Trey realized this logic was backward. The children weren't protected by his presence. They were traumatized by the constant conflict. They were learning that screaming and violence were normal, acceptable, the way adults resolved problems. Trey and Maya separated, agreeing to shared custody, 1 week with Mom, 1 week with Dad. For the children, life split into 2 distinct realities. At their mother's house, tension ruled. Maya cycled through boyfriends. The children learned to walk quietly, speak softly, avoid triggering her anger. The older ones developed a system of protection for the younger ones. Brooklyn and Taylor would take blame for things Trey Jr. or Ezekiel did, absorbing their mother's fury to shield the little ones. At their father's house, a different world existed. Trey had a girlfriend named Ivy Gedry, a calm, soft-spoken woman who contrasted sharply with Maya's volatility. Ivy had 2 daughters of her own. The 6 children quickly formed a blended family unit, laughing, playing, secure in the knowledge that adults in this house didn't explode without warning. Ezekiel especially loved weekends at Grandma Cynthia's house. Every Friday when the children were with their father, Trey would drive them to her place. Little Zeke, 2 years old now, walking and talking in his toddler language, would knock on the door calling Mama, Mama, his version of Grandma. When she opened the door, he'd run straight for her keys, his favorite toy. The jingle of metal, the weight in his small palm, the way light reflected off the brass. He could play with those keys for half an hour, utterly content. Then he'd discover the pots and pans in the lower kitchen cabinet. He'd pull them out and bang them with wooden spoons, creating a racket that made Cynthia laugh, even as she pretended to complain about the noise. When he looked up at her with those huge eyes and that smile, nobody could resist that smile. When Ezekiel was in the house, Cynthia would later say, the whole house glowed. He was pure light. Shortly after Ezekiel turned 2, Trey enrolled him in daycare near their home. The first day, Ezekiel hid behind his father's leg, uncertain in this new environment. By the end of the week, he'd become the center of attention, and his teachers discovered he had a remarkable gift. When music played, any music at all, Ezekiel's body couldn't help but move. He'd start dancing, stomping his little feet, waving his arms, spinning in circles. Other children would stop what they were doing to watch. Then they'd start copying him, and soon the whole room would be dancing, following Ezekiel's lead. He was a natural entertainer, unself-conscious and joyful. His teachers adored him. Photos from this period tell a story words struggle to capture. January through April 2022, the last truly happy months. In every picture, all 6 children are smiling. A trip to the zoo shows them gathered at animal enclosures, pointing and laughing. Ezekiel stands in a bright jacket, mouth open in delight at the sight of elephants. A friend's birthday party in April. Cake, balloons, music. Ezekiel, as always, is dancing. A trip to the coast that same month becomes an unforgettable day. Ivy builds sandcastles with Ezekiel while his siblings play nearby. In every photo, he's smiling. In every photo with Ivy or his father, you can see genuine happiness radiating from him. He was the life of every gathering, the center of joy. But during the weeks at his mother's house, something was changing. Trey started noticing when the children returned to his care. They were quieter, more withdrawn. The older ones avoided his gaze and flinched at sudden movements. His younger daughter began wetting the bed again, a regression that alarmed him. The children would cling to him when it was time to return to their mother, crying and begging to stay. Trey tried talking to Maya about his concerns, but any question was treated as an attack. She'd explode, then take her anger out on the children after Trey left. The children returned with new bruises, new fear in their eyes. Trey understood he had to act decisively. He consulted lawyers, began documenting everything, filed for full custody of all 4 children. The lawyers reviewed his evidence, the bruises, the behavioral changes, the testimony he'd gathered from teachers and family members. They told him the case looked solid. The hearing was scheduled for Friday, July 15, 2022. Just hold on, they told him. Just a few more weeks, and the children would be safe permanently. What Trey didn't know was that Maya had applied for housing through an organization called The Haven, a non-profit that provides emergency shelter for victims of domestic violence. In her application, Maya wrote that she feared her children's father, that Trey was aggressive and controlling, that she needed protection. The Haven, operating with limited resources and relying on applicants' self-reporting, approved her request. In May 2022, Maya was given a small 1-story house at 145 Kadia Street in Houma. It was meant to be a fortress, a safe space where a woman escaping domestic violence could rebuild her life with her children protected. Maya moved in with her 4 children and her new boyfriend, Jermaine Robinson. The Haven's staff didn't know, perhaps didn't have the resources to discover, that Jermaine Robinson had a criminal history that should have disqualified him from living in that house. What Maya herself knew or chose to ignore remains unclear, but Robinson's past painted a clear picture of a man who should never have been near children. In 2009, Robinson lived in a house with multiple children. He had shown then what would become a pattern. Small children triggered uncontrollable aggression in him. In that house lived a 16-month-old girl. During one incident, Robinson punched the infant in the stomach with such force that she required emergency surgery. Doctors told investigators she nearly died. Robinson was charged and convicted of second-degree child abuse. The sentence was shockingly lenient, 5 months in jail. Robinson also had convictions for distribution of illegal substances, hit and run, and armed robbery. He was a habitual methamphetamine user. This was the man Maya Jones brought into a house, provided specifically to protect children from violence. Robinson's true nature emerged almost immediately. He began yelling at the children over trivial matters. A toy left on the floor, crumbs on the table, laughter he deemed too loud. Maya didn't intervene. Robinson regularly directed violence at her as well, yet she remained. Soon Robinson implemented a system of control. The children would be locked in a single bedroom for hours, sometimes entire days. 4 children, ages 2 through 10, confined to one room with no freedom to leave, even to use the bathroom. Court documents would later reveal that a bucket was placed in the corner for their needs, and this bucket often went unemptied for days. Ezekiel, still being potty-trained at 2, and his 8-year-old sister Taylor, who'd begun wetting herself from fear, were subjected to particularly brutal punishment for their accidents. Robinson would beat them. There was insufficient food. Robinson and Maya, both using methamphetamine regularly, would forget to feed the children or simply choose not to let them out of the locked room. The children were constantly hungry. Sarah Pleasance lived directly across the street from House 145. Her second-floor window faced their home. For weeks, she couldn't sleep. Every night brought screaming, children crying, sounds of things breaking. On June 17th, close to midnight, she couldn't bear it anymore and called 911. In later interviews, Pleasance described the pattern, Robinson's voice screaming for hours on end, any time of day or night, days in a row. The abuse was so loud, she had to move her own daughter to a different bedroom because the child couldn't sleep through the noise. When police arrived on June 17th, Robinson answered the door calm and smiling. One of the kids broke a phone, he explained with a shrug. Got angry about it. But everything's fine now. Maya stood behind him and confirmed his story. The officers, with no visible signs of immediate danger and a mother vouching that all was well, left. On July 4th, Maya's own mother, Jackie Jones, arrived unannounced at the house. What she saw terrified her. Maya had a yellowing bruise under one eye, scratches on her neck, dried blood at the corner of her lip. She was thin, her eyes glazed with that distinctive emptiness that comes from drug use. Jackie tried to see her grandchildren, but Maya blocked the door and refused to let her inside. Alarmed, Jackie called 911 from her car. Police came again. By the time they arrived, Maya had covered the bruise with makeup. Robinson stood behind her in the doorway. Everything's fine, she told the officers. They left. In early July, during what would be their last visit to their father's house, Grandmother Cynthia noticed Ezekiel was different. He didn't knock joyfully on her door. He didn't run for her keys. He was quiet, withdrawn, his usual light dimmed. When Trey tried to arrange the next scheduled visit, Maya refused. She wouldn't answer his calls, wouldn't respond to messages. He insisted, citing their custody agreement. She hung up. On July 8th, a neighbor saw Ezekiel standing alone in the driveway of House 145. The neighbor waved and called out a greeting. Ezekiel stared back with empty eyes and didn't respond, didn't wave, didn't smile. It was the last time anyone outside that house would see him alive. On July 9th, Jackie Jones called 911 for a third time, desperate now. Police came to the house. Maya refused to let them inside. The officers, operating under legal constraints that require consent or evidence of immediate danger to force entry, left again. Police Chief Coleman would later defend these responses in press conferences and interviews. "We can't break down doors without evidence," he explained. "If a woman says everything's fine and we see no immediate threat, we legally cannot force our way in or force her to accept help." These statements, while technically accurate, would haunt him. 4 children remained in that house for 2 more days, with a man whose methamphetamine use and history of child abuse made him a walking time bomb. July 11th, 2022. Robinson was high on methamphetamine. Maya was high as well. The 4 children were locked in the bedroom, hungry, frightened, surrounded by the smell of their own waste from the unemptied bucket. Ezekiel was crying. He was a 2-year-old child who wanted food, who didn't understand why he was being punished, who just wanted his daddy. Robinson's already thin control snapped. He dragged the boy out of the room and started beating him. Maya would later claim she tried to intervene, that she got between them. Robinson grabbed a knife and slashed her leg deeply, down to the bone. "I'll kill you and all these kids if you interfere," he reportedly said. Maya backed away. She left her 2-year-old son alone with a man who had once nearly killed an infant. In the locked bedroom, 3 children sat huddled on the floor together. They were 7, 8, and 10 years old. They listened to the blows. They listened to their baby brother screaming. They couldn't do anything to help him. They were children, trapped, terrified, helpless. Then the screaming stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the screams because they understood what silence meant. The Terrebonne Parish Coroner's Office would later determine cause of death: multiple blunt force head trauma. The medical examiner's report used careful language: severe blunt force trauma, systematic beating. But the reality those words described was almost impossible to comprehend. This wasn't one blow or two in a moment of rage. This was methodical, sustained violence. An adult man's fists and feet against a toddler's skull, a 2-year-old who couldn't defend himself, couldn't escape. couldn't do anything but endure until his small body gave out. July 12, 2022. At 12:04 in the afternoon, Maya Jones called 911 from a stranger's house near Bayou Terrebonne. Her voice was shaking, barely coherent. "My son," she sobbed. "A man in a grey truck grabbed him right off my back while we were walking. Just stopped and took him. Please, you have to help me." The city mobilized instantly. The Houma Police Department, Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's Office, Louisiana State Police, even the Coast Guard responded. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors thumping rhythmically over the bayou. Boats swept the waterways. Divers in wetsuits searched the murky water. Tracking dogs followed scent trails along the banks. Hundreds of volunteers joined the search, neighbors, strangers, people who couldn't sit at home knowing a toddler was missing in their community. While the search continued, Detective Travis Theriot did what good detectives do. He questioned the story. He requested surveillance footage from the area where Maya claimed the abduction occurred. What he saw on those tapes didn't match her account. The footage showed Maya walking with 3 children and a baby carrier on her back, exactly as she described. Theriot watched the footage repeatedly. Something was wrong. The carrier hung too flat against her back, too light, moving in a way that indicated it was empty. He requested footage from additional cameras. A neighbor's security camera on Kadir Street had captured something entirely different. At 2:17 in the morning, nearly 10 hours before Maya's 911 call, the camera showed Maya and Robinson leaving the house. He was carrying a black Adidas duffel bag over his shoulder. The bag appeared heavy, pulling his shoulder down with its weight. At 2:43 a.m., another camera near a corner store captured the same couple, same bag. At 4:52 a.m., they returned to the house. No bag. Empty hands. They moved calmly, casually, like people returning from an ordinary late-night errand. Detectives brought Maya to the station. Detective Theriot and Chief Coleman sat across from her in the interview room. For 3 hours, they pressed her on the inconsistencies. The empty baby carrier, the security footage showing her leaving the house in the middle of the night, the timeline that made no sense. Gradually, her story crumbled. 3 police cars pulled up to a house on Doucebet Street, 2 blocks from the station. Maya, handcuffed in the back seat, pointed to a trash can at the curb. Police Chief Dana Coleman walked to the can, opened the lid, saw the ants, and smelled death, and threw up. Inside the black Adidas duffel bag, Ezekiel Harry lay curled in a fetal position. He was wearing light-colored pajamas with a cheerful pattern. His hands were folded on his chest. Insects crawled across his face, through his curly hair, into his half-open mouth. His small hands showed defensive wounds, mangled from trying to protect himself. He'd been thrown away like garbage while the entire city searched for him, while helicopters circled overhead, while his father held his other children and prayed for good news that would never come. The news spread through Houma within hours. That same night, police arrested Jermaine Robinson and Maya Jones. Both were charged with first-degree murder and obstruction of justice. Both were held without bond. The 3 surviving children, Brooklyn, Taylor, and Trey Jr., were immediately placed with their father and grandmother. By the next morning, the trash can on Doucebet Street had transformed into a memorial. Neighbors brought teddy bears, balloons, toy trucks. Women stood nearby openly weeping, holding their own children tighter. Police Chief Coleman held a press conference, his voice tight with controlled emotion. The district attorney spoke about the charges, the evidence, the process ahead. "It just shocks the conscience that this type of abuse would go on," he said, "and it certainly establishes that this case is potentially a death penalty case." What caused additional outrage throughout the community was the knowledge that police had been called 3 times. 3 times in 3 weeks, officers had come to that house, talked to Maya, seen signs of trouble, and driven away, leaving 4 children inside with a man whose criminal record screamed danger. On July 15, 2022, the day that should have been Ezekiel's salvation, a memorial service was held instead of a custody hearing. Trey Harry didn't attend. He couldn't. The grief was too overwhelming, too raw. Instead, Ivy Gedry stood before the crowd on the courthouse steps, the woman who'd built sandcastles with Ezekiel just months earlier, who'd read him stories, who'd loved him like her own. Grandmother Cynthia was there, barely able to stand, supported by other women. People who'd never met Ezekiel came to mourn him. On July 23rd, the funeral procession made its way through Houma. About 400 bikers from across the region formed an escort, their motorcycles rumbling in synchronized tribute. The little boy whose mother had treated him as trash received a send-off worthy of a hero. In September 2022, Robinson and Maya appeared in court for preliminary hearings. Both entered pleas of not guilty. Both remained in custody without bond. The family searched desperately for answers, for understanding, for some logic in what had happened. It seemed justice would come quickly given the overwhelming evidence. No one anticipated the trial would drag on for years. In 2023, the cases were separated for tactical reasons. Maya, through her attorney, began cooperating with prosecutors, testifying against Robinson. Her defense strategy centered on battered woman syndrome. She was a victim too, they argued, so terrified of Robinson that she couldn't act to save her son. In October 2023, testimony from the 3 surviving children was admitted as evidence. What they'd witnessed, what they'd endured, began entering the official record. In August 2025, prosecutors announced they would no longer seek the death penalty for Maya Jones in exchange for her full cooperation. For Robinson, capital punishment remained on the table. More than 3 years after Ezekiel's death, the trial continues to be delayed. Robinson's case was postponed to March 2026. Trey Harry attends every hearing, sits in the courtroom, watches the man who killed his son. "I cry every 15 minutes, he said in interviews. "Every single day I wake up and remember he's gone." Ezekiel Harry was 2 years and 11 months old when he died. He loved to dance. He loved his grandmother's keys. He hugged strangers. He had a smile nobody could resist. His whole life should have been ahead of him. Now let's shift our focus to Atlanta, Georgia, and a parallel tragedy that unfolded 5 years earlier, connected to Ezekiel's story by the same threads of systemic failure and ignored warnings. On October 13, 2017, in the Oakland City neighborhood, another family's nightmare was reaching its terrible conclusion. But to understand what happened that night, we need to go back to the beginning, to 1993, when Lamora Williams was born. From early childhood, Lamora was different. Her parents, Brenda and her husband, noticed their younger daughter developed differently from their older daughter, Tabitha. Lamora was secretive, withdrawn into herself, what the family delicately called unusual. Some of her behaviors were genuinely disturbing. She decapitated her dolls and stored the heads separately from the bodies. Once she cut her older sister with a knife, not seriously, but enough that her parents became openly afraid to leave her alone, unsupervised. When Lamora started school, new problems emerged. She struggled to concentrate and absorb material. Teachers reported she communicated poorly with adults and peers. Eventually, she was transferred to homeschooling, with her father taking primary responsibility for her education. They spent considerable time together, and he showed infinite patience with his daughter's challenges. He became her anchor, the one stable point in her world. Her parents tried to get professional help, but Georgia's healthcare system in the late 1990s and early 2000s couldn't provide adequate support for a child with Lamora's complex needs. No formal mental illness was diagnosed. Therapy with a psychologist yielded minimal results. As she entered adolescence, Lamora seemed to improve. She returned to school, developed a social circle, behaved more typically. In high school, she fell in love, or what she understood as love. She was eager to experience life. In 2011, at 18, Lamora gave birth to her first child, a daughter named London. The relationship with London's father quickly dissolved, and Lamora returned to her parents' home. Despite the breakup, London's father and his family continued helping raise the girl, often taking her for extended stays. The relationship and birth had a positive effect on Lamora's mental state. She devoted attention to caring for her daughter, though due to her continuing challenges, much of London's care fell to Lamora's father. In 2012, Lamora met Jamil Penn through mutual friends. He was energetic and optimistic, a sharp contrast to Lamora's reserved, withdrawn nature. Despite their differences, they became interested in each other. What started as casual dating grew serious. They moved in together, and Lamora's family welcomed the energetic young man warmly. Her father especially appreciated Jamil, seeing in him a reliable person who could care for his troubled daughter. Soon the young couple had a son together. Jamil held his firstborn son proudly, and Lamora named the baby after him, Jamil Jr. The boy was sociable and easygoing. Very soon, the following summer, Jamil Jr. got a brother named Kayaunte. This baby was surprisingly calm, looking at the world with serious, adult-like eyes from his earliest days. The year 2014 became devastating for the entire Williams family. One morning, Jamil went to his father-in-law's room to invite him to breakfast, as was their custom. What he found froze him in place. His father-in-law was dead, had been for hours. The quiet, patient man who'd been the backbone of the large family was gone. His death hit everyone hard, but for Lamora, her father had been her main anchor in the world. The family unanimously noted that it was after this tragedy that Lamora's mental state deteriorated sharply. What began as grief developed into severe depression. After her father's death, the couple and their children moved to their own apartment in Oakland City, hoping a fresh start might help. The summer of 2015 brought a third son, Jakarta, a beautiful, healthy boy with remarkable brown eyes and a charming smile. He won the hearts of the extended family immediately. Only Lamora seemed indifferent, going through the motions of motherhood by inertia. The family understood 3 children in 3 years was overwhelming for any woman and tried to support the young mother. For Jamil, his sons were the center of his life, his love and pride. He worked hard to provide, trying in evenings to spend time with the children and help Lamora with household tasks. Being chronically tired and sleep-deprived, Jamil didn't immediately realize his relationship with Lamora was irreparably damaged. Depression, compounded by postpartum complications, had consumed her entirely. One day she'd drive him from the house in rage. The next she'd want to reconcile and start over. Their arguments were loud enough for neighbors to hear regularly. They'd see Jamil storm out, slamming doors, shouting in anger. But the next day he'd return, unable to stay away from his children. Knowing his deep attachment to his sons, Lamora constantly manipulated him with access to them. She knew he'd always come back. By summer 2017, the situation became so untenable that Jamil left the family unit. Now he saw his children only on weekends. He gave money to Lamora regularly and bought groceries, fearing she might forget to feed them. Lamora would stay in her bedroom for days, leaving the children unattended. She became increasingly aggressive, creating dramatic scenes, throwing objects. Several times the situation escalated so severely that Jamil had to call the police. He found himself in an impossible position. Legally, he didn't have full custody rights, and Lamora weaponized this. She allowed him to see his sons only when she wanted something from him: money, attention, hope for reconciliation. Lamora sank deeper into depression, only showing life when he arrived. The children suffered most. They lived in an oppressive atmosphere of unpredictable maternal indifference, punctuated by explosive anger. Neighbors began noticing disturbing things. Children's crying came from the Williams apartment at all hours. Sometimes 3-year-old Jamil Jr. appeared at the window, gesturing to people on the street as if trying to communicate something. Brenda Williams, Lamora's mother, desperately tried to save her grandchildren. She called the Georgia Department of Family and Children's Services almost daily, begging them to intervene and remove the children from what she knew was a dangerous situation. "I told them she's sick. She's not feeding the children. She's dangerous," Brenda recalled in interviews. They replied they needed evidence of physical abuse. Lamora's sister, Tabitha, supported their mother's efforts, but the system remained unresponsive to their pleas. "We knew tragedy was inevitable," Tabitha said later. "The question was only when it would happen." In September 2017, Lamora lost her job. She couldn't manage being a mother to 3 small children while maintaining employment. Neighbors reported frequently hearing children crying from the apartment. Lamora would leave the boys alone all day, going places unknown. Early October brought a new wave of conflicts between Lamora and Jamil. On October 11th, they exchanged angry messages. She accused him of abandoning the family. He demanded the right to see his children. The correspondence ended with Lamora threatening he'd never see his sons again. At this point, Jamil hadn't seen his boys in approximately a month. His attempts to visit were met with Lamora's fierce resistance. On the morning of Thursday, October 12th, neighbors didn't hear the usual sounds of children from the Williams apartment. By evening, a strange smell began emanating from the unit, a smell neighbors would later describe to investigators as the smell of death. It would later be determined that October 12th was when those terrible events began that would culminate in tragedy. The morning of Friday, October 13th, began ordinarily for most Oakland City residents. Around noon, Lamora left the apartment and didn't return for 12 hours. In the afternoon, Jamil was just 2 blocks from the home where his children lived. He desperately wanted to see them, felt drawn to them, but didn't go, fearing another explosive conflict with Lamora. He hadn't seen his sons in a month. Around 11 p.m., Lamora made the first of several fateful calls. She called her friend Nissa Smith and said something that made Nissa freeze. "I can't take it anymore." When Nissa asked what was happening, Lamora confessed that both boys were dead. The shocked friend begged Lamora to call police immediately. Instead, Lamora made a video call to Jamil. What he saw on his phone screen would be seared into his memory forever. The camera moved slowly around the kitchen, showing an overturned electric oven and small bodies on the floor. Jamil immediately dialed 911. His voice shook and broke as he tried to explain to the dispatcher what he'd just seen. "I just received a call from my child's mother that 2 of my youngest sons are dead in an apartment," he said, his words tumbling over each other. The dispatcher tried to calm him, to get clear information. "I've seen it," he kept saying. "I really think they're really dead." Almost simultaneously, Lamora also called 911, but her call had a strange quality. Instead of asking for help for her children, she repeatedly asked if she would be arrested. She worried more about her own fate than about her sons. She gave gruesome details but framed them in a fabricated story. She claimed she'd just returned from work to find her cousin had left the children alone and they'd knocked over the stove. "My baby boy, my oldest baby boy, is the only one alive," she told the dispatcher. "Only one is alive. The youngest son's head was under the stove," she said. "My other son was laid out on the floor with his brains out." The dispatcher tried to get the address, but Lamora kept circling back to herself. "I don't want to get locked up because this is not my fault," she repeated multiple times. "I just came home from work. Can you please help me? I don't want to get locked up." More than 2 minutes passed before she finally provided her address. Around 11:30 p.m., the first police units arrived at Howell Place. Officers went up to the apartment and found a scene that shocked even veterans. Lamora stood in the living room, strangely calm, almost detached. 3-year-old Jamil Jr. stood beside her. He hadn't cried in hours. He just hiccuped quietly and stared, his face showing that blank shock that comes from witnessing horror beyond a child's capacity to process. In the kitchen, officers found an overturned electric oven with small feet visible underneath. When they lifted the stove, the scale of tragedy became fully apparent. 2-year-old Kayonte and 1-year-old Jakarta were dead. Their tiny bodies bore injuries that were impossible to look at. The medical examination would later confirm both boys died from what the report carefully termed thermal changes, effects of prolonged exposure to dry heat. However, the prosecutor's report would be more direct, stating the children's bodies were covered in burns and that Williams had placed them in the oven. An important detail emerged. Neighbors had smelled death from the apartment for several days before bodies were discovered. This suggested the tragedy occurred not on the night of October 13th when Lamora called 911, but much earlier, possibly October 12th or even before. Nobody slept that night in Oakland City. Detectives and forensic experts worked through the darkness, beginning the painstaking process of reconstructing what happened. The oven was removed as evidence. Neighbors crowded the street, whispering fragments of news about the tragedy. When the children's bodies were carried out, people wept openly. The tiny forms were barely visible on the large stretchers. The devastated father wandered aimlessly on the street, holding his only surviving child, little Jamil Jr., close to his chest. At the scene, Lamora told officers she'd left the children with an unnamed cousin for 11 hours while at work. She claimed she returned around 11 p.m. to find the door open and the children dead. This story disintegrated rapidly under scrutiny, No neighbors had seen any cousin. Moreover, Lamora hadn't had a job for over a month. The smell neighbors noticed for days, combined with the nature of the injuries and the state of decomposition, demonstrated the children had been dead long before their mother's discovery of them. The most heartbreaking element was that 3-year-old Jamil Jr. had likely witnessed his brother's murder. During initial interviews, when gently asked what Mommy did to his brothers, the boy went silent. His lips trembled and he whispered that he wanted to see Daddy. Nobody doubted the boy had seen too much, and it had profoundly damaged his mental health. In the early hours of Saturday, October 14, 2017, Lamora Williams, 24 years old, was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder. She was placed in Fulton County Jail without bail and put under 24-hour suicide watch due to concerns she might harm herself. News of the tragedy spread through Atlanta rapidly. The local news covered the story extensively, and the disturbing 911 call was released to the public. Neighbors gathered near the house on Howell Place, many crying as they remembered the little boys many had known personally. A makeshift memorial appeared. Flowers, stuffed animals, candles, notes. A memorial service was held, bringing together many people who came to support the grieving family. Jamil was in profound shock. The images he'd seen through that video call haunted him. "I lost my soul," he would tell reporters later. Brenda Williams, though devastated by her daughter's actions, said she wasn't surprised. "My daughter is sick," she stated, emphasizing that the system had ignored all the family's warnings. The story became a tragic example of what happens when mental illness goes untreated and cries for help are systematically ignored. Investigators continued gathering evidence. The medical examiner's report was cautious in its language, confirming both boys died from thermal changes due to prolonged exposure to dry heat. Court documents and prosecutor reports stated the children's bodies bore burns and that Williams placed them in the oven, though the exact mechanism and timeline remained subjects of investigation. A critical detail emerged. Neighbors had smelled death from the apartment for several days before October 13th, suggesting the tragedy occurred earlier than Williams claimed. This raised agonizing questions. Why didn't neighbors report the smell to police? Why didn't neighbors report the constant sounds of crying children and a neglectful mother? Why did Brenda Williams's many calls to Child Protective Services go without adequate response? What if Jamil, driving past that afternoon just 2 blocks away, had stopped to check on his children? Would it have changed anything? These questions haunt everyone connected to the case. 8 days after the tragedy, on Saturday, October 21st, the funeral for Kayonte and Jakarta was held at a Baptist church on West Hunter Street. The church overflowed. Not just relatives and friends, but many strangers shocked by the tragedy attended. Funeral director Willie Watkins was deeply moved and offered his services free of charge. He paid all funeral expenses and provided plots at historic Southview Cemetery, Atlanta's oldest African-American cemetery. The caskets were sealed because the condition of the bodies made open casket viewing impossible. After the service, the procession moved to the cemetery. Small white caskets decorated with the boys' favorite cartoon characters were carried in a carriage pulled by white horses, a final tribute to innocent victims. The inconsolable father held Jamil Jr. tightly, the little boy still not understanding his brothers would never return. On February 2, 2018, a grand jury indicted Lamora Williams on an expanded list of charges: 4 counts of felony murder, 2 counts of murder, 2 counts of aggravated assault, 2 counts of concealing a death, 1 count of making false statements, and 3 counts of cruelty to children. The last charge was added because 3-year-old Jamil Jr. was in the apartment during his brother's deaths and likely witnessed it. While in custody, Lamora received 2 additional charges: battery causing substantial physical harm and obstructing a law enforcement officer. Though bail was technically set, given the severity of charges, Lamora remained in custody. On May 30, 2018, a preliminary hearing was held. Lamora appeared before the court and pleaded not guilty to all charges. The court scheduled trial to begin in January 2019. The defense claimed Lamora's long history of mental illness made her unable to fully understand her actions. Her lawyers noted she was often uncommunicative and didn't respond to attempts at interaction, indicating serious mental disturbance. Because of her condition and need for treatment, the path to justice threatened to stretch across years. While Lamora awaited trial, Jamil tried to rebuild his life. He created a GoFundMe campaign to raise money for funeral costs and therapy for his surviving son. In his appeal, he wrote movingly, "Jamil Jr. will never see his brothers again. I will never see two of my sons again, all because of mental illness. I'm not the same person anymore, but I have to be strong for the only child I have left. Rest in peace, my two kings." Little Jamil began intensive therapy with psychologists helping him process the trauma. But the boy continued talking about that terrible day, remembering details that shattered his father's heart. "He knows they're dead, but still thinks they'll come back," the father shared. The path to sentencing was long. Many hearings were scheduled and postponed. The defense insisted on psychiatric evaluation and treatment, while prosecutors demanded maximum punishment. Throughout this period, Lamora remained in jail. According to those who had contact with her, she showed complete lack of remorse. Even in phone conversations with Jamil, she displayed no emotion when he asked about the reasons for her actions. After years of legal proceedings, in November 2024, 7 years after the deaths, a verdict was finally reached, considering testimony from 9-year-old Jamil Jr. The investigating social worker's report noted that when she questioned the boy, he was smiling and made eye contact, saying he felt good. When asked what he saw that horrible night through the eyes of a 3-year-old, he stated Jakarta and Taman died, referring to his deceased brothers by their nicknames. When asked what happened, the boy said they got on the stove themselves. He also stated he watched as they got on the stove. Lamora Williams was found guilty on 14 counts. The court sentenced her to life in prison without possibility of parole plus an additional 35 years. The defense argued to the end that Lamora's mental state prevented her from fully understanding her actions, but the jury rejected this position. Let's step back now and examine the broader context surrounding both these tragedies, not to excuse what happened, but to understand how systems designed to protect children failed so catastrophically in both Louisiana and Georgia. The parallels between Ezekiel Harry's case and the Penn brothers' case are striking and disturbing. In both instances, multiple people recognized danger and tried to intervene. In Louisiana, neighbors called police 3 times in 3 weeks. In Georgia, a grandmother called Child Protective Services almost daily for an extended period. In both cases, authorities responded. Officers came to homes, spoke to mothers, observed situations, and then left children in danger. The question that haunts both cases is why? Why do systems designed specifically to protect vulnerable children so consistently fail when it matters most? The answer is complex, involving legal constraints, resource limitations, bureaucratic inertia, and sometimes simple human error or indifference. Let's examine the legal framework first. In both Louisiana and Georgia, as in most U.S. states, child protective laws attempt to balance 2 sometimes competing interests: protecting children from harm and protecting parental rights. Police and social workers cannot simply remove children from a home based on suspicion or a third-party report alone. They need evidence of immediate danger or parental consent to enter a home without a warrant. When Maya Jones and Lamora Williams said everything was fine, when they provided plausible explanations for bruises or crying, officers had limited legal authority to override their statements without concrete proof of abuse. Chief Coleman's defense of his officers, "We can't break in without evidence," was legally accurate if morally unsatisfying. This legal framework exists for good reasons. Historically, child protective services have sometimes removed children too hastily, causing trauma to families where children were actually safe. The pendulum has swung between aggressive intervention and parental rights protection throughout American history. But when the pendulum swings too far toward protecting parental rights, children pay the price. The challenge is finding the proper balance. Resource limitations compound the legal challenges. Child Protective Services agencies in both Georgia and Louisiana, as in most states, operate chronically understaffed and underfunded. Social workers carry enormous caseloads. When Brenda Williams called repeatedly about her grandchildren, her calls went into a system overwhelmed with reports. investigators must prioritize, focusing limited resources on cases presenting the clearest immediate danger. When a grandmother reports concerns about her daughter's mental health and parenting, but the children haven't been hospitalized, and the mother denies problems, that case gets lower priority than one where a child has appeared at school with broken bones. This triage system is necessary given resource constraints, but it means some children fall through cracks. Training is another factor. Police officers responding to domestic disturbance calls receive training on recognizing abuse signs, but they're not child psychology experts or medical professionals. When they arrived at 145 Cadia Street, and Jermaine Robinson calmly explained a child broke his phone, and he yelled about it, the officers saw no visible injuries on children, no immediate crisis, and a mother backing her partner's story. They made a judgment call that the situation, while perhaps not ideal, didn't meet the threshold for removing children. They were wrong, tragically wrong, but understanding why they made that call requires acknowledging the difficulty of the job. There's also the phenomenon sometimes called system fatigue. When police respond repeatedly to the same address for minor issues and nothing serious ever materializes, they may begin discounting reports from that location. The neighbors who called about screaming from Robinson's house had called before about noise. To the responding officers, this may have seemed like another neighbor dispute rather than a child in mortal danger. This doesn't excuse failure to investigate thoroughly, but it explains part of the psychological dynamic. The domestic violence shelter system adds another layer of complexity to Ezekiel's case. The Haven provided housing to Maya Jones based on her self-reported claim of being a domestic violence victim fleeing an abusive partner. The organization, operating with limited resources, couldn't conduct extensive background checks on every applicant or their partners. They relied on Maya's account. When she brought Jermaine Robinson into the home, the Haven's staff didn't know his history. Should they have known? Perhaps. But domestic violence shelters face a constant dilemma. Implement strict screening that might deter genuine victims from seeking help, or accept applicants more readily, and risk situations like this. There's no easy answer. In Georgia, the system failure was slightly different but equally deadly. Brenda Williams wasn't a neighbor reporting suspicions. She was the grandmother, someone with intimate knowledge of her daughter's mental health history. She told Child Protective Services repeatedly that her daughter was dangerous, wasn't feeding the children adequately, was in crisis. Yet no investigation resulted in removing the children or providing intensive intervention. Why? Partly because Lamora denied problems and refused cooperation, partly because Jamil, despite his concerns, didn't file for emergency custody or full custody until it was too late, partly because the symptoms Brenda described, depression, neglect, isolation, while serious, didn't meet the narrow legal standard for emergency child removal, and partly because the system was overwhelmed. These explanations aren't excuses. Children died because systems failed, but understanding the failure mechanisms is essential for preventing future tragedies. After Ezekiel's death, there were calls for reform in Louisiana. Some advocated for mandatory arrests when police respond to domestic violence calls involving children. Others called for better training to recognize abuse signs. Some demanded increased funding for child protective services. After the Penn brothers' deaths, similar calls emerged in Georgia, with particular focus on investigating reports from family members more seriously. Reform is difficult because it requires resources, political will, and overcoming institutional inertia. It also requires confronting uncomfortable truths. Both Maya Jones and Lamora Williams were themselves victims in some sense. Maya of domestic violence, Lamora of untreated mental illness. Both were also perpetrators, making choices that led to their children's deaths. The system struggles with this duality. How do you help someone who's both victim and perpetrator? How do you protect children without criminalizing mental illness? These questions don't have simple answers. What is clear from both cases is that the children had no voice in the system. Ezekiel couldn't call for help. The Penn brothers couldn't advocate for themselves. Adults failed them, their mothers partners, the neighbors who heard screaming and did too little, the police who saw signs and didn't intervene, the social workers who didn't prioritize their cases. The system is made of individual humans, making individual decisions. Sometimes those decisions, made with incomplete information under time pressure with limited resources, are wrong, and children die. Now let's turn to the perpetrators themselves and try to understand, not forgive but understand, the psychology that led to these horrific acts. Jermaine Robinson's history painted a clear picture. His 2009 conviction for nearly killing a 16-month-old girl demonstrated a pattern. Small children triggered violent responses in him. That conviction should have been a permanent red flag, a warning sign that Robinson should never be around young children unsupervised. The sentence he received, 5 months in jail, was shockingly lenient, perhaps reflecting a plea deal or judicial discretion that prioritized rehabilitation over punishment. Robinson also had convictions for drug distribution, hit and run, armed robbery. This was not a person making one terrible mistake. This was a person with an established pattern of violence and disregard for others. His methamphetamine use added another dangerous element. Methamphetamine can induce paranoia, aggression, and psychosis, particularly in heavy users. Someone prone to violence against children becomes exponentially more dangerous under the influence of meth. The question becomes, why did Maya Jones bring him into her home with her children? Did she know his history? If she did, what drove her to accept that danger? If she didn't, that represents another system failure. Criminal records that should have been accessible weren't checked or weren't available. Maya's own psychology is more difficult to parse. She had no apparent history of violence before Ezekiel's death. She'd raised 3 older children without serious abuse allegations. What changed? Her relationship with Robinson clearly played a role. Domestic violence experts describe a phenomenon where abuse victims sometimes become perpetrators themselves, either actively joining abuse or passively allowing it through fear. Maya's defense would later claim battered woman syndrome. She was so terrorized by Robinson she couldn't protect her son even when he was being beaten to death. This claim is difficult to evaluate. Did she genuinely fear for her life if she intervened? Or is this a post hoc rationalization for inexcusable failure to protect her child? The evidence suggests some truth to the fear claim. Robinson did cut her leg severely with a knife, reportedly threatening to kill her and the children if she interfered. But this same evidence shows she chose to stay in the relationship, chose to keep her children in that house, chose not to seek help from her family or the police until after Ezekiel was dead. Her decision to help dispose of the body to create an elaborate false abduction story, to let the city search for her son, while knowing he was dead in a trash can, these actions suggest consciousness of guilt and deliberate deception rather than a terrorized victim unable to act. Lamora Williams presents a different psychological profile. Unlike Robinson, who had clear antisocial patterns, Lamora had documented mental health challenges from childhood. Her early behaviors, decapitating dolls, cutting her sister, poor social functioning, suggested possible conduct disorder or early signs of personality disorders. Her father's death triggered deterioration, with depression becoming severe, and potentially complicated by postpartum depression after each child's birth. The question in Lamora's case is whether her mental illness absolves her of responsibility. Her defense argued she couldn't understand her actions due to mental disturbance. The prosecution argued her elaborate cover story, calling 911, blaming a fictional cousin, expressing concern about being arrested, showed she understood what she'd done was wrong and tried to avoid consequences. This suggests legal culpability regardless of mental illness. What drove her to kill her children? Depression alone doesn't typically lead to filicide. Most people with depression, even severe depression, don't harm their children. More commonly, filicide connected to mental illness involves psychosis, delusions or hallucinations that lead a parent to believe killing their children is necessary to save them from some perceived worse fate. There's no evidence Lamora experienced psychotic symptoms. The alternative explanation is darker. She killed her children because they were burdens she couldn't cope with, obstacles to the life she wanted, or targets of displaced rage about her own circumstances. The medical evidence in Lamora's case, that the boys died from prolonged exposure to extreme heat, that their bodies bore burns, that neighbors smelled death for days, suggests the deaths weren't impulsive, but occurred over time. This implies she didn't act in a sudden psychotic break, but made ongoing choices to harm or neglect her children until they died. After they were dead, she made calculated choices about how to respond, eventually deciding to create a false story blaming a cousin. 3-year-old Jamil Jr.'s statement that he watched his brothers get on the stove themselves is particularly haunting. Was this what actually happened? 2 toddlers somehow climbing into or onto the stove and being unable to escape? Or is this what Lamora told him happened, and he at 3 years old couldn't distinguish between what he saw and what he was told? Or is this a 3-year-old's way of processing trauma too terrible to articulate accurately? Child testimony is notoriously difficult to interpret, especially from very young children describing traumatic events. What seems clear is that Jamil Jr. was present when his brothers died, witnessed something horrific, and carries that trauma. Both cases raise difficult questions about criminal justice responses to mentally ill defendants. Should Lamora Williams spend life in prison, or should she be in a psychiatric facility? She clearly has serious mental health issues. Equally clearly, she killed 2 children. The justice system's answer, life without parole, prioritizes punishment and public safety over rehabilitation. Robinson's case is more straightforward. He has a history of violence, showed no remorse, and the death penalty remains on the table. But even here, questions linger. If the justice system had responded more appropriately to his 2009 conviction for nearly killing an infant, if he'd received a sentence measured in years rather than months, if he'd been permanently barred from contact with children, would Ezekiel still be alive? The system failed these children before they were born by allowing dangerous people to remain in positions where they could harm children. Neither Maya Jones nor Lamora Williams acted alone. Both had partners who were either actively involved or passively complicit. Jermaine Robinson directly killed Ezekiel. Lamora directly killed her sons. But the fathers of these children also bear examining, not as perpetrators but as men who struggled to protect their children within a system that gave them limited power. Trey Harry fought for custody, gathered evidence, filed legal motions. He did everything the system theoretically allows fathers to do. But the hearing that would have granted him custody came 3 days too late. In those 3 days, his son was murdered. The question that must haunt him: what if he'd acted differently? What if he'd shown up at Maya's house despite her objections? What if he'd physically removed his children, risking arrest for custodial interference? Would Ezekiel be alive? We can't know. But the system that required him to wait for a court hearing, to follow legal processes, to not take the law into his own hands, failed to protect his son while he followed those rules. Jamil Penn faced similar constraints. He had no legal custody rights. He could see his children only when Lamora permitted it. When she cut off contact, he had limited recourse. He could have filed for emergency custody, but that requires evidence of immediate danger. And how do you prove immediate danger when you're denied access? He drove past the apartment that afternoon, 2 blocks away from his sons in their final hours, and didn't stop. He'll live with that decision forever, even though any reasonable analysis suggests he made the understandable choice to avoid another explosive confrontation with Lamora. The system that gave Lamora sole custody, despite her documented mental health issues, despite family members' warnings, despite obvious signs she was struggling, put Jamil in an impossible position. Let's turn now to the investigations themselves and how each case was ultimately solved. In Ezekiel's case, Maya's false abduction story began unraveling almost immediately. Detective Travis Theriotta's decision to check surveillance footage before fully committing resources to an abduction search was smart, experienced police work. The footage showing Maya with an empty baby carrier contradicted her story's core claim. The footage of Maya and Robinson carrying a heavy duffel bag in the middle of the night, then returning without it hours later, provided a timeline and evidence trail. When confronted with this contradictory evidence during the interrogation, Maya's story collapsed. 3 hours of interrogation broke her, and she led police to the trash can. This investigation took less than 24 hours from the 911 call to arrest. Efficient, effective police work, But the investigation also revealed 3 previous police visits to the house in 3 weeks. This detail, once public, caused outrage. What were police doing during those visits? What did they see? What questions did they ask? The police reports from those visits became evidence of systemic failure. Officers had noted bruises, had heard explanations, had talked to Maya and had left. Each visit represented an opportunity to save Ezekiel. Each visit ended with police driving away. The investigation into police conduct itself became part of the larger story. In the Penn brothers' case, the investigation was more complex because Lamora's initial story, that a cousin left the children alone and they accidentally knocked over the stove, had elements that could plausibly explain the scene. But investigators quickly identified problems. No cousin existed or could be found. Lamora claimed she'd been at work, but she'd been unemployed for a month. The smell neighbors noticed for days before October 13th suggested the children died earlier than Lamora claimed. The nature of the injuries suggested prolonged exposure rather than a sudden accident. Lamora's 911 call itself became evidence. Her repeated concern about being arrested rather than focus on her children suggested consciousness of guilt. When investigators interviewed Jamil Jr., the 3-year-old's statements, though cryptic and difficult to interpret, provided crucial testimony. Though he couldn't articulate clearly what happened, he could confirm he'd been present. He'd seen something terrible involving his brothers and his mother, and he was traumatized. The forensic evidence, the burned bodies, the overturned oven, was examined exhaustively. Could 2 toddlers have climbed into or onto an electric oven and been unable to escape? Was this an accident, negligence, or intentional killing? The medical examiner's conclusion of thermal injuries from prolonged heat exposure suggested the children were exposed to lethal heat for an extended period, inconsistent with a quick accidental encounter. Both investigations benefited from modern surveillance technology. Security cameras provided objective evidence that contradicted defendants' stories. This technology has transformed criminal investigations over the past 2 decades. Cases that once relied on witness testimony and physical evidence now have visual records. But surveillance also revealed something disturbing: how close both families lived to populated areas. Ezekiel was thrown in a trash can 2 blocks from a police station on a residential street with neighbors nearby. The Penn brothers died in an apartment complex with neighbors on all sides. These weren't isolated rural areas where crimes could occur unseen. These were communities where people were physically close enough to hear screaming, smell death, see concerning behavior. Yet the crimes still happened. This speaks to urban isolation, the tendency to not get involved in neighbors' business, the bystander effect where everyone assumes someone else will act. Some neighbors did act. They called police or child protective services, but many didn't or didn't act quickly enough. After both crimes were discovered, neighbors expressed guilt and horror. I heard the screaming but thought it was just a bad argument. I smelled something strange but didn't want to seem nosy. I saw the children look sad but figured it wasn't my business. These statements reflect normal human tendencies but collectively represent a community failure to protect vulnerable children. The legal proceedings following arrests revealed stark differences between the cases. In Louisiana, prosecutors quickly identified this as a potential death penalty case, given the extreme brutality against a toddler. The cases were separated to allow Maya to testify against Robinson. Her cooperation secured her a deal removing death penalty consideration. This prosecutorial strategy is common: secure cooperation from a lesser defendant to strengthen the case against the primary perpetrator. Robinson, identified as the person who actually killed Ezekiel, faces capital charges. Whether prosecutors ultimately seek death penalty or accept a life sentence will likely depend on jury composition, case strength, and political considerations. Louisiana has performed executions as recently as 2010, though death sentences have become rarer. The trial's repeated delays, now scheduled for March 2026, nearly 4 years after the murder, reflect the complexity of death penalty cases and the heavy burden of proof required. In Georgia, Lamora's case took 7 years from arrest to conviction. This delay reflects both mental health evaluations and legal procedural requirements. Her attorneys argued she was incompetent to stand trial due to mental illness, requiring psychiatric evaluation and treatment. The prosecution had to demonstrate she understood the charges and could assist in her defense. This process took years. Her eventual conviction on all 14 counts and sentence of life without parole plus 35 years effectively ensures she'll die in prison. The jury rejected the mental illness defense, determining she understood her actions and their consequences. The aftermath of these cases extends beyond the perpetrator's punishments. 3 children, Brooklyn, Taylor, and Trey Jr. Harry, lost their brother and are growing up with the trauma of knowing their mother participated in his death. Jamil Jr. Penn lost both his brothers and his mother, witnessed horrors no child should see, and must build a life carrying those memories. These surviving children represent the case's longest-lasting impact. Studies on childhood trauma show children who witness or experience extreme violence suffer lifelong effects. PTSD, anxiety, depression, difficulty forming relationships, increased risk of substance abuse, and criminal behavior in adulthood. The surviving Harry children and Jamil Jr. will need extensive, possibly lifelong therapy and support. Their father, Trey Harry, and their grandmother, Cynthia, now bear responsibility for helping them heal, while dealing with their own grief and guilt. Jamil Penn faces the enormous task of being a single father to his traumatized son while processing his own loss. Both fathers lost children to violence perpetrated by women they once loved, trusted with their children's care. Both fathers followed legal procedures, tried to work within systems, believed those systems would protect their children. Both were proven tragically wrong. The families of Maya Jones and Lamora Williams also suffered immensely. Brenda Williams lost her grandchildren and her daughter in a sense. Lamora's life imprisonment means Brenda's daughter is gone, even though she's alive. Brenda's guilt over failing to convince authorities to intervene must be enormous. She knew her daughter was dangerous, called repeatedly, warned everyone, and still couldn't prevent the tragedy. Jackie Jones, Maya's mother, similarly tried to intervene, calling police multiple times, and faced the same helpless frustration when authorities didn't act. Both grandmothers now carry the knowledge that they saw the danger, tried to raise the alarm, and weren't heard until it was too late. The broader communities also felt impacts. In Houma, Louisiana, and in Atlanta's Oakland City neighborhood, residents struggled with how this happened in their midst. Memorials sprung up, teddy bears, balloons, flowers, candles. Memorial services brought hundreds of people. These communal mourning rituals serve important psychological functions, allowing communities to process collective trauma and reaffirm shared values. The 400 bikers who escorted Ezekiel's funeral procession represented a community's attempt to restore dignity to a child treated as trash. The white horses pulling the Penn brothers' caskets represented similar symbolic restoration. Media coverage of both cases was extensive and, in some instances, sensationalized. The horrific nature of the crimes, children murdered by mothers or mother figures, generated national attention. Nancy Grace covered both cases on her show, as did various other true crime media outlets. This coverage served mixed purposes. On one hand, it raised awareness about child abuse and systemic failures, potentially preventing future cases. On the other hand, it sometimes prioritized shock value over meaningful analysis, presenting perpetrators as monsters rather than examining the complex factors that led to tragedy. The coverage also impacted legal proceedings. Defense attorneys in both cases had to navigate pre-trial publicity, arguing that inflammatory media coverage prejudiced potential jurors. In Lamora's case, the release of her 911 call to the media, where she repeatedly worried about being arrested rather than focusing on her children, became powerful evidence of her consciousness of guilt, but also ensured no potential juror could come to trial without preconceptions. This is the reality of modern high-profile criminal cases. The court of public opinion runs parallel to legal proceedings, and the two inevitably influence each other. Policy discussions following these cases focused on several areas. First, mandatory reporting laws. Louisiana and Georgia, like all states, require certain professionals to report suspected child abuse, but should this extend to neighbors and community members? Some advocated for broader mandatory reporting with penalties for failing to report, while others worried this could inundate an already overwhelmed system with low-quality reports. Second, police training and protocols. Should officers responding to domestic disturbance calls have more discretion to remove children temporarily when abuse is suspected? Current laws generally require concrete evidence or parental consent, but officers on scene sometimes can sense danger without meeting legal standards for intervention. Expanding police discretion risks abuse, but might save lives. Third, domestic violence shelter policies. Should organizations like The Haven conduct more extensive background checks on residents' partners? This would require additional resources and might deter some genuine victims from seeking help if they fear their partners will be scrutinized. Fourth, Child Protective Services funding and staffing. Almost everyone agrees CPS agencies need more resources, but in practice, funding increases rarely match need. Some jurisdictions implemented reforms following these cases. Louisiana's legislature considered bills strengthening penalties for child abuse and expanding circumstances where police can remove children without parental consent, though passage faced opposition from civil liberties advocates concerned about government overreach into families. Georgia's Child Protective Services received some increased funding in following budget years, though advocates argued it remained insufficient. The Haven and similar domestic violence organizations implemented new policies requiring disclosure of anyone living in shelter-provided housing and conducting basic background checks, though resource limitations constrain thorough vetting. These reforms represent incremental improvements, but fall short of systemic transformation. The fundamental challenges remain: balancing parental rights with child protection, adequately funding social services, training first responders to recognize abuse, and overcoming bureaucratic inertia. Until these challenges are addressed comprehensively, children will continue falling through cracks in the system. Each high-profile case prompts temporary attention and minor reforms, but lasting change requires sustained political will and public investment that rarely materializes. Let's examine one final angle: the psychology of community response and collective responsibility. When children die from abuse in plain sight of communities, everyone involved experiences guilt to varying degrees. Neighbors who heard screaming wonder if they should have done more. Teachers who noticed children seemed withdrawn question whether they reported concerns forcefully enough. Family members who sensed danger replay conversations, wondering if they'd said something different, pushed harder, taken different actions, whether outcomes would have changed. This collective guilt is psychologically normal, but often unproductive. Most people who could have intervened did take some action, but individual actions within a broken system aren't enough. The solution isn't more individual guilt, but better systemic responses. Communities need clear pathways to report concerns and confidence. Those reports will be investigated thoroughly. We need what child protection experts call collective efficacy, the sense that communities have both responsibility and capacity to protect children together. This requires trust in systems, which is difficult when systems repeatedly fail. It requires resources to respond to reports adequately. And it requires cultural shifts in how we think about children's welfare, moving from "not my business" to everyone's responsibility. As we approach the conclusion of this investigation, let's remember what these cases are ultimately about: children. Ezekiel Harry, a 2-year-old boy who loved to dance and play with his grandmother's keys, whose smile could light up a room. Kayante Penn, age 2, whose serious eyes made him seem older than his years. Ja Carter Penn, age 1, with beautiful brown eyes and a charming smile that won hearts instantly. These weren't statistics or case numbers or media stories. They were individual human beings with personalities, preferences, potential, futures that were stolen from them. Their deaths weren't inevitable natural tragedies, but preventable failures of human systems and human choices. Adults failed them, their mothers' partners, the systems meant to protect them, the communities around them. These failures compound the tragedy. We can't bring these children back. We can't undo the suffering they endured in their final days and hours. We can't restore the families destroyed by these crimes. What we can do is honor their memories by learning from these failures and committing to do better. That means supporting adequate funding for child protective services. It means training police officers to recognize abuse and giving them appropriate tools to intervene. It means strengthening domestic violence shelter policies. It means taking seriously reports from family members who know children are in danger. It means creating community cultures where child welfare is everyone's responsibility. Ezekiel Harry would be 5 years old now if he'd lived. He'd be in kindergarten, probably still dancing whenever music played, maybe playing sports or learning an instrument. The Penn brothers would be 9 and 10 years old, in elementary school making friends, discovering interests and talents. Brooklyn, Taylor and Trey Jr. Harry are growing up without their baby brother, carrying trauma but also carrying his memory. Jamil Jr. Penn is 9 years old now, having lived most of his life without his brothers, but their absence shapes his childhood. These surviving children are this story's living legacy. How well we support them, how well we prevent future tragedies like theirs, determines whether we've learned anything from these deaths. In Trey Harry's victim impact statement, he said he cries every 15 minutes every single day, remembering his son is gone. That grief will never fully heal. Jamil Penn described losing his soul when he saw his son's bodies on that video call. That trauma is permanent. The best we can offer these fathers and these families is justice, however imperfect and delayed, and commitment that we'll work harder to protect other children so fewer families suffer this particular agony. As of this recording in October 2025, Jermaine Robinson awaits trial scheduled for March 2026. He faces the death penalty. Maya Jones serves a sentence with death penalty removed in exchange for cooperation, but her specific sentence length remains undetermined pending Robinson's trial conclusion. Lamora Williams is serving life without parole plus 35 years in Georgia State Prison. The surviving children are growing up in the care of their fathers and extended families, receiving therapy and support, building lives despite trauma. The systems that failed Ezekiel, Kayante, and Jakarta continue operating much as they did before, with minor reforms but no fundamental transformation. Every day in America, Child Protective Services receives thousands of reports of potential abuse. Every day, police respond to domestic disturbance calls involving children. Every day, social workers make judgment calls about which cases require immediate intervention. Most of the time, the system works adequately. Children at risk are identified and helped, but the system's failures when they occur are catastrophic and irreversible. We owe it to Ezekiel Harry, Kayante Penn, and Jakarta Penn to demand better. We owe it to every child currently at risk in an unsafe home to build systems robust enough to catch them before tragedy strikes. These 3 little boys deserved better. They deserved to grow up, to dance, to smile, to live full lives surrounded by people who loved them. They deserved a system that protected them when the adults closest to them failed to do so. Their deaths should mean something. Their stories should drive change. That's the final tribute we can offer them. The commitment that we'll learn, will improve, and will save the next child whose situation mirrors theirs. Rest in peace, Ezekiel Harry. Rest in peace, Kayante Penn. Rest in peace, Jakarta Penn. You deserved so much better than the world gave you.